Okay, welcome to Level 1 Science Online with Henny van Vieren.
Here we go. Hi Year 11s, this is take 2 of the same lesson that I recorded yesterday, but you'll see this full screen face of myself. I never took that away. So consequently I was presenting and presenting, but nobody could see my PowerPoint. Ha ha. Fail. Anyways, let's hope today's better. Alright, so, variation. Okay, why do we have variation in our species? And we've talked about this before. Variation is extremely important for all biological things. And the reason is that it gives us adaptation advantages. Variation is for survival of the species. Very important. So you'll all know that in your own family there's variation. Some of you might have brothers and sisters or an aunt or um, somebody that you know that gets sick all the time, or somebody that is super fast, or somebody that is super strong. Um, and all of that gives us, as a species, um, a survival advantage. Think about it. If the world was suddenly overrun by, I don't know, really fast cheetahs, the super fast and agile people will survive, and the species will survive. Or the people who are really agile and can jump and climb trees will survive. Not that cheetahs hurt people at all, but never mind. So, but how do we get this variation? This variation, even if you think back to when we are in class, some of us have red hair, some of us have blonde hair, some of us have very little hair, um, some of us have dark hair. There's lots of variation in there. Did you know the first person to ever have blue eyes? That was a single mutation, and consequently the person developed blue eyes. Now, all new alleles, every single one of it, whether it's hair color, eye color, speed, you name it, all those new alleles are from mutations. Okay? And the variation that brings in new alleles are always from mutations. Now, there's two other things that bring in variation, and that is during meiosis, when the mom and the dad produce eggs and sperm. There's a mix-up of the grandmother and grandfather's genetic material, and that's called crossing over and independent assortment. So when you get, I mean, when if there's an egg, it's got a mix-up of the grandparents of that egg's genetic material, because the mom's chromosomes, remember, she's got one chromosome from the mom and one chromosome from the dad, and she's got 23 pairs of these. So your body then mixes them up and spreads them into the eggs. And your dad, or the male sperm, same thing happens there. His parents' DNA, his parents' chromosomes are all mixed up and then distributed equally into the sperm. So consequently, every little sperm and every little egg is unique. That's why you and your brother and sister don't look alike unless you're identical twins. You will share some traits, absolutely, because remember, traits are alleles that are dominant, or that are not necessarily dominant, but are um, that comes out in the phenotype. And you will share some alleles with your brothers and sisters. You might all have, I don't know, the same hair color or things like that. You might look very similar, but you are not identical. And that is again to help with variation. And the last part of variation and how it occurs is during sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, there's a few things that happen there, but it can sometimes be how a female will choose a mate, and if it's, for instance, the strongest lion or the most beautiful bird or something like that. So it's all on mate selection, but also then it's a random sperm and a random egg that actually get together to form the zygote. It's not a predetermined sperm and a predetermined egg. So it is completely, and that we call that random fertilization. Okay, so if you look at this, Mutations introduce new alleles into a population. So you would have, for instance, the normal parents. They would have babies, and suddenly one of them have a mutation. Now that mutation, depending on where it happened, if this mom or dad had a mutation in their egg cell when they were producing the egg cell, then that will be passed on to the offspring. So a mutation in the egg or the sperm in the parents, and that egg and sperm was then fertilized, that will give rise to the mutant. But sometimes it can be an advantageous thing. Sometimes it can be a disadvantage. Sometimes, and mostly, it is actually silent and nothing really happens. Okay? Um, Now, if this does not happen, we have a few mutations that can occur, but mutations that form new alleles that can be passed on, they have to happen in the sex cells. They have to happen in the sperm and the egg. We call them the gametes, remember? If you have a mutation, think about it. If you have spent a lot of time in the sun and you develop skin cancer, which is a mutation because of the sunlight, the UV rays, will you pass that on to your child? No, because the mutation was not um, in your gametes. If you cut yourself or you went for an operation and you have a really bad scar, are you going to pass that on to your offspring? Absolutely not. Okay, so new alleles um, are formed when we have a mutation, but they're only passed on to the offspring if the mutation was in the gametes. It's really, really important. Okay. Alright, so, and they occur randomly. In the gametes, they can be inherited, but if it's in the somatic cells, that's your normal body cells, then they do not. So we can sometimes, the way that we describe a mutation is a permanent change of the base sequence in the DNA. A permanent change of the base sequence of the DNA. Now let's have a look at this one. This is, for instance, that's the original chromosome, and the whole section of B there was deleted. So a permanent change in that DNA happened. Okay, but this is what's called a chromosomal mutation, whereas you can have a mutation on only a gene, and so forth. Alrighty. Now, what can cause mutations? Things like X-rays. But you know that Madame Curie, she worked really hard on radiation and radioactivity, and she unfortunately died because of the cancer that was caused by the radiation that she exposed herself to. But her notebook that she wrote all her notes in is still radioactive. They have it in a museum in France, and it's behind thick layers of lead glass to make sure that none of the radiation can get out. UV radiation, ultraviolet. We have UVA and we have UVB. So that's when you spend too much time in the sun and you burn. Now, that UV radiation is ionizing. So what it means is it goes and it can knock electrons on or off or into a higher state in your body, and that causes the mutation. And in New Zealand, we have an extremely high level of ultraviolet. The reason for that is we have the hole in the ozone. And when you look at the hole in the ozone, it partially covers New Zealand. So in comparison to the rest of the world, we are probably the worst off with UV radiation. So you need to be really careful, guys. It can cause skin cancer, which is a mutation. Cigarette smoke, all kinds of different things that people inhale, they can all potentially contain a mutagen. So a mutagen is something that causes a mutation. Okay, your diet and so forth, other chemicals that you expose yourself to. Just last week in the news was that the Pike River mine, I don't know if you remember the Pike River mine tragedy, but the people who went in to go and get the bodies, um, So back in 2010, there was a big explosion and the miners all died. Now the bodies have been in there since then, and they are sending in a team to go and get the bodies, but unfortunately, because of the explosion, the whole place is covered in mutagenic material. So mutagenic stuff that will cause cancer, stuff that will cause a mutation. Now here's human papillomavirus. We've talked about this before, HPV. This virus causes cervical cancer a lot in young women, okay? But it doesn't only, it's a sexually transmitted virus, okay? But it doesn't only cause cervical cancer. It will also cause anal cancer and mouth cancer, tongue cancer, lip cancer. So if you're a guy and you say, oh, that's fine, I don't have a cervix, yeah, but you have a lot of other things that might be affected by this. And also, you don't want to be someone who gives someone else cancer, do you? So we currently have a jab or an immunization where you can get immunized against HPV. And I'm really hoping that all of you got immunized against HPV. Because literally, if you have this immunization and this virus enters your body, it will get killed and you won't get the cancer. It's as simple as that. Get an immunization, prevent this cancer. It's amazing. Now, Helicobacter pylori, really, really cool organism. It will actually screw into the side of your stomach lining. It's like a corkscrew. That's why it's called helix. Okay, so it corkscrews into your stomach lining, and then unfortunately, a lot of your stomach acid will go down and actually get to the cells and start eating it away, and then you get ulcers. And when you get ulcers and ulcers and ulcers and ulcers, eventually you can get a mutation that happens there. Okay, then the last one that we have is inheritable genetic disorders. Inheritable disorders are basically a mutation that you inherit from your mom or your dad. Okay, so if you have blue eyes, you have an inherited mutation, your blue eyes. But it's not a genetic disorder. Just genetic disorder is harmful. Okay, so things like sickle cell anemia, things like cystic fibrosis, and so forth. So, for instance, last year I had a student and she knows that she's a carrier of the cystic fibrosis gene. It's luckily it's recessive, and because she only has one allele for it, the other allele is dominant for normal, so she doesn't have cystic fibrosis. But she needs to know this, that because if she then marries somebody who also have the recessive cystic fibrosis gene, they might have kids that have full-on cystic fibrosis. So, and that would be an inherited genetic disorder. They are usually very rare, but the mistakes need to take place during DNA replication and meiosis. Okay, and meiosis is when we make egg and sperm. Okay, we also have genetic mutation, things like Down syndrome, and we've talked a lot about these. Sickle cell anemia, also hemophilia. I've showed you Queen Victoria's bloodline and how she passed that on, and she was the first one in her family to actually get the mutation. So, yeah. Okay, so humans can have specific genetic disorders caused by these. There's your normal hemoglobin, and this is your sickle cell hemoglobin. Can you see how the mutation has caused this protein to be humongous? Okay, and because it's so big, it changes the shape of the red blood cell. The red blood cell is usually, if you think about it, it's like when you take blue tack and you roll it in the ball and you press it from both sides, you're going to have what's called a biconcave. So bi means two, cave, so biconcave, okay? Two indentations on each side. And that is how your blood cells look, your normal red blood cells. But when you have sickle cell anemia, and you're not homozygous for sickle cell anemia, but you're heterozygous for sickle cell anemia, then you produce normal blood cells and sickle cell blood cells. The amazing thing is, even though this is a very bad disease, and especially if you are homozygous, which means sickle cell, then you usually die very young. But in Africa, where you have a lot of malaria, the people with sickle cell, who are sickle cell heterozygotes, who have both the sickle cell and the normal, they are more resistant naturally to malaria. And because they are more naturally resistant to malaria, they had more kids than the people who didn't have that resistance. And when you are more successful and you pass your DNA on, you will get more people with sickle cell anemia. So in Africa, sickle cell anemia is a lot more prevalent than in other parts of the world where you do not have malaria. And again, it gives them a survival advantage. That is natural selection at its best. You have a kind of a disease, which is a genetic disorder, but it gives you a high resistance to malaria, which help you to survive longer, have more children, and more of your DNA is passed on. Okay. Remember, it's not survival of the fittest and the fastest. Not at all. It is survival of the best fit for your environment. Okay, so mutation summary. A mutation is a permanent change in the base sequence of a DNA strand. Either the single bases or segments of the chromosome. A base sequence change can result in the formation of new alleles. All new alleles were a base sequence change, which we call a mutation. Please remember that. A new allele can code for a new protein that leads to a new trait. The organism with the mutation may have a new structure or function as a result, and they will have a new phenotype. Now this one I don't agree with at all. Most mutations are not harmful. Most mutations are silent. But if they are harmful, they will reduce the chance of survival or reproduction. Some new phenotypes may increase an organism's chance of survival or successful reproduction. A mutated allele that increases survival will increase in frequency and rapidly will be more prevalent in the population. Okay, so NCA case study. One process that produces genetic variation is a mutation. Explain what mutations are and how they contribute to the genetic variation. In your answer, you should include what a mutation is, the effect of mutations on genes, alleles, and DNA, and whether all mutations are passed on to the next generation. Now let's break this down. What is a mutation? Remember, in biology, when we answer a question, we always start with the definition. Okay? So, a mutation is the permanent change of the DNA sequence that results in a change in the allele or change in the gene. The effect of the mutation on genes is usually silent, but it can sometimes have an advantage or it can sometimes have a disadvantage. But the point is the gene changes. If it is a new allele, because it is advantaged or disadvantaged, a new form of that gene will be formed. Whether all mutations are passed on to the next generation? No, they are not. Only mutations that have to do with the gametes, in other words, the sex cells or the sperm and egg. Only sperm and egg mutations will be passed on to the next generation. Okay, so let's see. The mutation is a change in genetic material. When a mutation occurs, the base sequence of the gene changes. This results in completely new alleles. If the mutation occurs in the gametes, these new alleles have the possibility of being passed on. If a mutation occurs in the body cells, I should have said this as well. If a mutation occurs in the body cells, only the one individual will show that variation. In other words, it will not be passed on to their offspring. Mutations are more often than not silent. I disagree with this person, but are not more often than not harmful if they occur in part of the DNA that codes for traits. Individuals born with mutations will often die before they pass the mutant allele on, depending on the severity. If a mutation results in variation, the variation is often in the form of entirely new alleles. If the new allele is beneficial and increases survival and reproduction of offspring is increased, it is spread quite quickly. We call that natural selection. Okay, so remember the Black Panther we spoke about earlier? So the Black Panther is a mutation of the normal leopard. Okay, now leopards are frequently nocturnal and can a lot of time be in very dense bush. So if you look closely, you can still see the patterning there on this Black Panther. It's a beautiful, beautiful animal. When I was a young boy, it used to be my favorite animal. But anyways, um, they give them this black coat. So there was a mutation in the coloration or the protein that codes for the coloration of the panther. And because of that, the organism now displays the phenotype of being black. So, how can this mutation cause the coat color to be different? In your answer, you should use the term DNA, gene, allele, phenotype, and mutation to explain how this color change occurs. The DNA diagram may help you. So, you're going to start by saying that a mutation is a permanent change in the DNA sequence of the base sequence, and and if that occurs within a gene, it will change the gene. If the the gene will then create a new allele, and that new allele may lead to a new phenotype. That new phenotype, if it is advantageous, will be naturally selected for, but if it is not, then obviously it will not be selected for and might very soon disappear from the population. However, a mutation is only passed on when it happens in the gametes, the sex cells or the sperm and egg, and if that happens, then this mutation might be passed on to the offspring. However, if this mutation, as we see it here, was only the somatic cells, not the gametes, then it will only affect this individual and will not be passed on. So I said a lot of words there, but that's the story. Okay, so in your own time, I want you to read through this. Okay, but let's just check the highlights. Gene is a length of DNA that codes for a particular characteristic or trait called a phenotype, such as the color, where the allele is an alternative form of the gene. There is one allele for black coat and different allele for normal. The two alleles make up the genotype. Okay, make sure that you tick them off as you speak about them. A mutation is a change in the material DNA genes of an organism. When a mutation occurs, the base sequence of the gene changes. This results in completely new alleles. If mutations occur in the gametes, these new alleles have the possibility of being passed on to the offspring. And that is where I'm going to end this lesson. So thank you very much. Have a great day.